There are restaurants in this world that do not advertise. They do not need to. The kind of place where a reservation requires not just 6 weeks of waiting, but the right last name, the right referral, and the quiet understanding that you belong there. Or, at the very least, that you can convincingly pretend you do. Aubergine and Oak sat on the corner of Wellington and King in the older part of Ottawa, the kind of block where the stone buildings remembered a different century, and the sidewalks were still wide enough to feel unhurried. The dining room held 32 seats. Every one of them was spoken for on any given Friday night, and the wait list for a Saturday ran 3 months minimum. The chef, a Quebecois man named Patrice, who had trained in Lyon and returned home out of stubbornness, had been profiled in the Globe twice and refused a third interview. The sommelier was Belgian and spoke 4 languages and had opinions about glassware that bordered on theological. And then there was Nora Venn. She had been working the floor at Aubergine and Oak for 2 years and 3 months, which made her the second most senior server in the room, a fact that surprised people who looked at her and saw only a young woman in a black apron carrying someone else's wine. She was 28. She had dark hair she kept pulled back on shift, and the particular kind of stillness that comes not from having nothing going on inside, but from having learned, very early, to keep it somewhere private. She moved through the dining room the way water moves around stone, not avoiding, exactly, just adapting, always finding the path of least resistance, always arriving exactly where she needed to be without drawing attention to the transit itself. She had not always planned to be here. 3 years ago, Nora had been finishing the 2nd year of PhD in comparative linguistics at the University of Toronto. Penelope, her focus had been language contact and creolization in Francophone West Africa, the ways that French had bent and been bent by Wolof, Bambara, Fula, the ways that colonial language had been taken apart and rebuilt into something the colonizers would barely recognize. Her supervisor had called her work quietly extraordinary, which in academic language meant she was doing something that mattered. She had grants. She had a conference paper accepted in Brussels. She had a small apartment on Bloor with a stack of monographs on her nightstand and a whiteboard covered in phonological trees. Then her mother got sick. Not suddenly. That was the thing people never quite understood when Nora tried to explain it later. It was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow one, the kind that takes everything from you incrementally, so that by the time you realize how much is gone, you have already adjusted to its absence. Her mother, Diane, was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's in January. By March, she could not drive. By September, she could not manage the stairs in the house in Kingston, where Nora had grown up. There was medication, and the medication needed managing, and there was a province-wide wait list for home care that moved like geology. Nora's father had died when she was 16. There was no one else. She deferred her program. She took a leave of absence. She moved back to Kingston for 6 months, and then, when it became clear that her mother was stable enough to live in a supported environment, but not stable enough to live without someone nearby who understood the whole picture, she looked for work in Ottawa, where she could be 40 minutes away by car and still have a life of some kind. Still be paying down the student debt from her master's, still be sending what she could to cover the costs the provincial support didn't reach. The PhD was still there technically. Her supervisor sent an email every few months. She had not replied to the last 2. Aubergine and Oak paid well, better than anywhere else she'd worked in the city, better than the French bistro where she'd spent 4 months the previous year, better than the hotel dining room that had offered her a position on the strength of her French, which was fluent enough to impress Anglophones, but, as Nora knew, still had the faint structural echo of someone who'd learned it in a classroom rather than a kitchen. The tips at Aubergine were serious. The clientele expected serious service and paid for it accordingly. And the work itself, the precision of it, the knowledge required, the way a good night on the floor felt less like waitressing and more like conducting, suited something in her that the university had also suited before. She had learned the cellar. She had learned the menu, every dish, every provenance, every allergy consideration. The name of the farm in Prince Edward County where the lamb came from, the name of the fishing operation in Nova Scotia where the halibut was sourced. She had learned the regulars, their preferences, their bad moods, their better ones. She had learned, because this is what the work required, how to be invisible when invisibility was wanted, and present when presence was needed, and how to read the difference in the first 30 seconds of arriving at a table. She was, in short, very good at her job. Most people at the table never noticed how good. The reservation for Table 7 that Friday was under the name Whitacre, a party of 4, 7:30, noted in the system as a business dinner. Nora had been assigned the table before the shift briefing had even finished. She recognized the name because the business section of the Ottawa Citizen had run a piece on him 3 weeks earlier. Elliot Whitacre was 47, the founder and CEO of a logistics technology company called Meridian Path that had recently closed a significant financing round and was, according to the article, in early discussions to acquire a smaller competitor out of Calgary. The piece had described him as relentlessly focused and not known for patience with inefficiency, which Nora had read as the financial press's polite way of saying he was difficult to work with. His photograph had shown a man with the kind of jaw that suggested he had opinions about other people's time management. He arrived at 7:22, which was early in the way that powerful men are sometimes early, not as a courtesy, but as a statement, a way of arriving into a space before it was ready for them, of making the room adjust to their presence rather than the reverse. He was taller than his photograph suggested. He wore a dark blazer over a navy crewneck, the kind of studied casual that announces itself as expensive without apologizing for it. The 3 people with him were younger. A man in his mid-30s with a consultant's watchful expression, a woman about the same age with a leather portfolio she had not let go of since entering the room, and another man, slightly older, who moved with the particular ease of someone who had been in rooms like this enough times that they no longer impressed him. Nora guided them to Table 7, distributed menus with the quiet efficiency that was her register for a first approach, and asked about sparkling or still. "Still," said Whitacre, without looking up from his phone. She brought the water. She gave them 4 minutes, which was the right amount of time, and returned. The 2 younger members of the party ordered efficiently. The woman chose the halibut, the consultant-looking man the duck. The older man, whose name Nora would later learn was Bertrand, asked a thoughtful question about the sauce on the lamb and listened to her answer with the genuine interest of someone who actually cooked at home. Whitacre had not yet looked at the menu. He put down his phone. He looked up at Nora for the first time since she'd seated them, and what crossed his face in that moment was something she recognized, had recognized, over 2 years on perhaps a dozen faces, the flicker of recalibration that happened when someone who had already decided who you were encountered information that complicated the picture. He looked at her the way certain men look at a server when they are deciding how much of their real personality to bother concealing. He decided not to bother very much. "Tell me," he said, in the particular tone of a man who considers himself educational, "do you know the difference between a Meursault and a Pouligny Montrachet, Or do you just point to whatever the sommelier marks up the highest? There was a small silence at the table. The woman with the portfolio looked down at her waterglass. Bertrand, who had better manners, kept his expression neutral with visible effort. Nora met Whitacre's eyes with the steadiness she'd had at 22 in her first seminar, when a professor twice her age had asked her, in front of the room, whether she was certain about her translation of a Fuller oral text. She had been told him so. She had been cert, also. The room had been quiet in the same way this room was quiet now. A Meursault comes from the Côte de Beaune, she said, and tends toward a rounder, more oxidative profile, notes of hazelnut and butter, lower acidity, broader texture on the palate. A Pouligny Montrachet, also Côte de Beaune, but from a different set of Premiers and Grands Crus, is usually more mineral, higher in acidity, finer in structure. They're about 12 kilometers apart geographically and about 30 meters of elevation apart climatically, which accounts for most of the difference. If you'd like to go deeper into the specific Crus, I'd be happy to, but it might be more efficient to tell me what you're eating and what you want to feel, and I'll find you what you're actually looking for. She said it without edge. That was important. Without edge and without performance, just information offered at the appropriate level of detail, door left open for more. Whitacre looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his face, not softened, exactly, but reconfigured. He was not a man who was used to reconfiguring. "I'll have the beef tenderloin," he said, "and bring me something you'd actually drink yourself, if you have opinions." "I do have opinions," Nora said. She brought him a glass of the 2019 Gevrey Chambertin from the producer in Burgundy, whose allocation they received in small quantities, and which the sommelier, Thierry, had been quietly triumphant about acquiring. It was not the most expensive option on the list. It was the right one. Whitacre tasted it. He did not say anything, but he did not say anything the way a person who is impressed does not say anything. A kind of held stillness, a recalibration happening in real time. The dinner proceeded. Nora returned at appropriate intervals. She cleared, she replenished, from the consultant about the cheese program, with enough specificity that he wrote something down in his phone. She was, as she always was, exactly present and exactly unobtrusive, both at once, which is a skill that cannot be taught and is rarely acknowledged. It was during the cheese course that Whitacre's manner changed again. He had been talking with Bertrand about the Calgary acquisition, the kind of conversation that paused when Nora approached and resumed when she moved away, which was standard, and which she had stopped noticing years ago, unless you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing. In the same way, she was clearing the side plates when she caught a few words in a language, when she caught a few answers that stopped her internal monologue mid-sentence. It took her 2 seconds to identify it. Ligurian, specifically the Genoese variant, a Romance language of the Italian Northwest that most linguists classified as distinct from Standard Italian, with its own phonology and syntax, and a written tradition going back to the 13th century. It was not a language that appeared in Canadian business dinners. It was not a language that appeared most places. Whitacre was speaking it to Bertrand in a low voice, with the easy fluency of someone who had learned it young. She placed him as having spent formative years in the region, possibly Genoa or the hinterland, possibly with family there. And what he was saying in Ligurian was that the woman with the portfolio, whose name was apparently Sandrine, had made a significant error in the preliminary valuation that no one had caught yet, and that if the Calgary side found out before he controlled the narrative, it would be a problem, and that Bertrand needed to get her out of the room for the second meeting tomorrow morning and let him handle the numbers himself. He said it with the total comfort of a man who had used language as a private channel his entire career and had never once encountered interference on that frequency. Nora set the cleared plates on her tray. She did not look at Whitacre. She did not change her pace or her expression. She walked to the service station, passed the plates to the runner, checked that the dessert menu had been properly stocked, and returned to the table. "Can I tell you about our dessert selections?" she said in English. "Go ahead," said Whitacre. She described the desserts. Then, as she finished, still in the same register, informational, unhurried, pleasant, she said in Ligurian, "If it would be more comfortable, I'm also happy to continue in Genoese." The sound Whitacre made was not quite any sound she had a word for. It was the sound of a door closing on a room that had, until that moment, been assumed to be private. Bertrand went very still. The consultant looked between them with the expression of someone who understood that something significant had just happened without knowing its exact nature. Sandrine looked up from her water glass. Whitacre's face did something complicated. He was a man who had built a significant portion of his professional identity on the ability to read a room before the room had finished forming its own opinion of itself, and he was sitting at a table in a restaurant in Ottawa, looking at a woman in a black apron who had just responded to him in the regional dialectic of a Ligurian variant that was spoken by perhaps 300,000 people in the world, most of them in a coastal strip of northwestern Italy. "Where?" he said slowly in English. "Did you learn that?" "Graduate school," Nora said. "Comparative linguistics. I spent a summer in Genoa for fieldwork. The dialect variation across the Ligurian interior is significant enough to warrant its own monograph, which I never got to finish writing." She paused, then added, with complete neutrality, "Shall I bring the dessert menus?" There was a silence at the table that had a different quality from the silences that had preceded it. "I'd like to know," said Sandrine, who had not previously spoken to Nora directly, "what he said, just now, before you answered him." Nora looked at Whitacre. It was not a challenging look, it was a question. Whitacre looked at the tablecloth. "It wasn't important," he said. "It concerned a valuation issue in the preliminary materials," Nora said, still in the same pleasant factual tone she used to describe the cheese program. He was concerned that it might affect the Calgary discussions tomorrow if it surfaced before he could address it directly. The silence that followed was of a different order entirely. Sandrine set down her water glass with a care that suggested she was making a deliberate choice about what to do with her hands. The consultant, whose name was Patrick, looked at his portfolio with the focused attention of someone deciding what role he wanted to play in the next 10 minutes. Bertrand, who had been in boardrooms long enough to recognize a structural shift when he felt one, exhaled quietly through his nose. Whitacre looked at Nora. His expression had moved through several things and arrived somewhere that was not quite anger, not quite respect, and was perhaps in the vicinity of a man encountering the edges of his own assumptions. "You should have told me," Sandrine said to Whitacre. Not loudly, very quietly, before the dinner. "You should have told me there was a problem." Sandrine, "We can talk about this tomorrow, and..." She looked at Nora. "Thank you." "Of course," Nora said. "I'll give you a few minutes with the dessert menus." She moved to the service station and refilled a water pitcher that did not need refilling, and gave the table the privacy it now desperately needed. Thierry appeared beside her with the expression of someone who had been watching from across the room and had questions. "Table 7?" he murmured. "It's fine," Nora said. "It did not look fine. It's fine now." He looked at her with the skepticism of a man who had worked with her long enough to know that "it's fine" covered a considerable range of situations, but he also knew better than to push it during service. The dessert course passed quietly. Whitacre ordered the dark chocolate tart. He did not speak again in Ligurian. He tipped 22%, which was above average for a business dinner, and which Nora suspected was not unrelated to the evening's events, though she could not have said exactly how. It was after the last table had cleared, when the dining room was being reset, and Thierry was logging the night's wine notes into the system, and the kitchen had gone quiet in the particular way. Kitchens go quiet when the last pan has been cleaned, that Nora sat in the small office at the back that the manager, a dry, efficient woman named Rosalind, used for scheduling and invoices. Rosalind had asked her to come in before she left. "I got a message," Rosalind said, "from a woman named Sandrine Acheb. She's with Meridian Path, one of the guests tonight." Nora waited. "She wants to know if you'd be interested in having a conversation. Not about the restaurant. About a position she's staffing on her team, something to do with international communications and negotiations," she said. Rosalind consulted her phone. "She said she'd been looking for someone with your particular skill set for 8 months and didn't expect to find them at her boss's business dinner. But here we are." Nora was quiet for a moment. Outside the office, she could hear the sound of chairs being stacked, the low murmur of the kitchen staff heading out, the particular end-of-shift sound of a restaurant putting itself to bed. "She left her number," Rosalind said, sliding a notacard across the desk. "I told her I'd pass it on. What you do with it is your business." Nora looked at the notacard, who had been having a better few weeks, whose physiotherapist had noted some measurable improvement in her fine motor stability. She thought about the whiteboard in her old apartment in Toronto, which she had photographed before she'd packed up the apartment, the phonological trees still visible in the background of the photo. She thought about the monograph she had not finished writing about the Ligurian interior in August, the way the language changed as you moved uphill from the coast, the way every valley had kept its own particular version of the vowel shift secret and specific and entirely its own. She picked up the notacard. "Tell her I'll call," Nora said. She folded it once and slid it into the pocket of her apron, next to her pen and her order pad, and went to help with the chairs.